Lovely to see you all. We're here to talk about neurodiversity. I'm going to introduce myself very briefly and the concept of neurodiversity, and then we're going to thank you, Dave, we are live, and then we're going to I'll go round to our panelists and let them introduce themselves. So my name is Dr. Nancy Doyle. I am a psychologist. I started a business called Genius Within about 12 years ago, and prior to that I worked in and continue to work in assessments, coaching, training, consultancy around neurodiversity in careers and the workplace. I also am a researcher at the University of London, where I founded the Centre for Neurodiversity Research at Work. So I'm going to say what neurodiversity means to me, but I'm very aware that our panelists might say other things and that you might be experiencing different things. So neurodiversity to me is the idea that all of us have different ways of thinking. It's a biological reality, a biological fact, that no two brains are exactly the same. Our brains are diverse. We think in different ways. What you might think neurodiversity means is a kind of synonym or an umbrella term for conditions like autism, ADHD, dyslexia, dyspraxia, tic disorders, and you might also include mental health distress or mental health diagnoses within that. And nobody's in charge of that. There's no neurodiversity police that decide where the barriers are. So, it's very much a movement, a kind of movement of people coming together to explore the idea that we all have different brains, and some of those brains are quite average. Some of those brains are exceptional in every way. Some of those brains are exceptional in very specific ways, and some of those brains are struggling in different ways. So that is what neurodiversity means to me. So I'm going to go through our panelists and I'll just tell them what order, because we haven't quite had enough prep time. So our order is Sarah, Steve, Chris, and then Whitney, because that's the order you appear on my screen. And so therefore I'm likely to remember it. I should also point out and say and be completely transparent, I am a neurodivergent thinker. I have ADHD, so memory support is always good for me. So Sarah, would you like to introduce yourself briefly and explain what neurodiversity means to you?
Sure. Thanks, Nancy. First of all, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Sarah Durkin. I am a senior HR manager with Highlands and Islands Enterprise. It's a generalist role, so I cover all the different aspects that fall within the HR remit for High. For me, neurodiversity is about those unique natures and traits within the brain, how people react in different situations, how they respond, and whether that has a label. Some of those, Nancy, you've obviously highlighted in your very precise kind of and detailed overview there. So some of them are widely recognized and some of them not so much. And for me, it's all about being inclusive, regardless of where you fall within the neurodiversity spectrum.
Thank you, Sarah. That's great. And so next we're going to Steve, because that's next on my list. Steve, welcome.
Thanks, Nancy. So my name is Steve Hill. I'm the commercial director here at Auticon. We're an international IT consulting firm. We're a social enterprise, and we exclusively employ autistic adults as our IT consultants. So my background really is Tier 1 tech. I spent many years in IBM, followed by Samsung, most recently McLaren Formula One on the data analytics side. And so what neurodiversity means to me, and I think the definitions we've already heard are fantastic. I think, for me, it's how everyone varies in terms of neurocognitive ability. I will go one stage further and sort of give you our take on autism, actually, as part of that. And so given the fact we're an IT consulting firm, we like to say that autism isn't a processing error, it's a different operating system.
And can I just clear there, because one of the things that I think is happening a lot in the world is that people are hearing the word neurodiversity and assuming it means autism. And so I just think we need to be quite clear that autism is one neurotype that is slightly unusual and falls within that scope, and that there are other neurotypes. So autistic people have different operating systems, so do dyslexics, so do people with tic disorders, so do ADHDers, and those operating systems aren't necessarily the same in their unusualness as the autistic operating system, although there is a lot of overlap between the conditions and between the different experiences. So thank you, Steve. Yeah, thank you, Steve, and welcome. Chris, would you like to introduce yourself, and what does neurodiversity mean to you?
Okay, well, I'm an autism advocate, and up until 3 weeks ago, I used to be a teacher as well. In a previous life, I was a mainstream primary school teacher, and until very recently, I was a teacher teaching maths, creative writing, and autism-based wellbeing sessions in a school specifically for autistic students. And these days, like I said, full-time advocate now, do speaking engagements and staff training and things. And they possibly the main reason I was invited on this panel is because I'm also an author. I published the Underdog series, which is basically neurodivergent dystopia. Very short version. It's about a near future war where the vast majority of the heroes are teenagers who escaped an attack on their special school. So it's a novel series of autistic heroes, dyslexic heroes, and so on and so on. And what does neurodiversity mean to me? Well, I think with a lot of words, there's the dictionary definition of it and how we talk about it. The dictionary definition we've already discussed, but very accurately. The way that I talk about it, and the way that in my totally biased opinion I think we should all be talking about it, is how is in the context of neurodivergent people, autistic, dyslexic, etc., being valid and valuable, and the fact that autistic people, for example, don't exist by accident. We're not a little inconvenience to the human gene pool that I guess we can accommodate if we're feeling kind enough. It's human progress depends and relies on diversity of thought. So that means autistic people contribute to human progress, dyslexic people do, neurotypical people do, and so on. And the progress in the discussion about neurodivergence seems to be leading towards the fact that neurodiversity is not an accident, and the more we value those who think differently, the more progress we can make as a society.
Wonderful, thank you, Chris. I think that's the known as the evolutionary critique of neurodiversity, which is that there are 15 to 20% of the population with some form of minority neurotype, and that's a very large minority. It's a significant minority for there to be no value. And so a question arises as to how we value human contribution, how we define success in our society, and who's included and who isn't. And we've got a great question already from the chat, but I'll come back to that because I'd like Whitney to introduce herself and say what neurodiversity means to her. So Whitney, over to you.
Thank you. My name is Whitney Isles. I am the founder, CEO of a social enterprise called Project 507, slightly different from the rest of the panelists because I kind of specialize in youth and community work, as well as doing some work within the creative industry. And I am particularly interested in kind of working with children and young people that have experienced complex trauma. I am neurodivergent myself. I'm autistic. I have co-occurring neurodiversity. So I'm autistic with ADHD and dyspraxia. Losing my words. I will disclose here as well that I'm also in recovery for PTSD as well, because I think that kind of plays into the autistic experience as well. And for me, neurodiversity is about difference. And I just wanted to add something else to the conversation, because as much as we say neurodiversity and we tend to kind of really think about the brain, I think for so many of us, neurodiversity is a full body experience. It is very much around our sensory processing and how we engage in the world. And, you know, it's not just about our thinking, but it's about just our being and our presence in the world and attempting to navigate through many different systems as well, and how that not only kind of might affect our cognitive functioning, but also might affect our whole body and our whole internal systems, and bearing that in mind within this conversation as well. So that's what I would like to add to the points that were already made.
That's a wonderful addition, Whitney. Thank you. So if creative industries is about seeing things differently or coming up with new ideas, surely this is the ideal sector to look at more diverse workshop. And I'm interested in what our colleagues here on the panel think around creative work and whether or not that offers opportunities for people with neurodivergent features. So as someone who works in creative industries, Whitney, can I come to you first and then speak to Chris and then Steve and then Sarah, if that's okay. Back up my list of faces. So yeah, what about creative industries, Whitney, do you think particularly works for neurodivergent thinking?
I think, so many of us have all these beautiful and amazing skills. So I really like, some days I really like big picture thinking, and sometimes I like kind of real details, and so many of my peers do as well. And I think creativity, if we think about film, for example, and kind of more visual aspects of things, it gives us the opportunity to kind of incorporate both. It's this big thinking, and then there's also the small details, depending on where your mind works or where your interests are within that. It also allows the flexibility. So kind of most of my peer group as well are neurodiverse and work in the creative industry. And it's about that not having to work the 9 to 5, not having to be kind of sitting down at a computer day to day, and each day almost being quite different. So I think that there's a lot of stereotypes as well around kind of neurodiverse people, especially autistics, that need kind of the pattern and the same day to day. And I do think that is part of being neurodiverse, but I think also kind of the ADHD in me likes to be able to move around, likes to have the difference, and likes to be able to express myself. And I think there's so much kind of creativity in kind of the neurodiverse community, and just the way that we might engage with the world. Those of us who have kind of real sensitive sensory systems, we're going to smell things differently, we're going to see things differently, and we can bring so much more vibrance to the work that we do, and it becomes so much more enjoyable, where a kind of a 9 to 5 can actually feel quite restrained, and it can be quite difficult to be engaging in kind of these I can't do a 9 to 5, and I can't work in an office for no one's business, because I need to move, and my body needs to experience kind of movement throughout the day. I can't just be sitting down. So I think kind of creative industries allow us so much more space to be who we are and thrive. They also allow us the flexibility of being able to do chunks of work. So being able to kind of do maybe 3 days on, 4 days off, and have that recovery space, because so much around kind of, for me and my experience of being neurodivergent, is about the recovery time that I need after maybe a kind of a hyper focus, or doing something that I really enjoy, or being really social. It's like, done that, I need a nap for 3 days now. And I think the creative industry really allows us that kind of flexibility.
Thank you. And Chris, how much of that is resonating with you as an author?
Honestly, a lot of it. I was just obviously thinking of my answer while Whitney was talking, because, well, common sense, try and brainstorming answers using other people's speaking time. But I wasn't doing much of a very good job of that, because I was too busy listening and agreeing. Because, I don't think it's a coincidence that I wish I had the statistics back stuff. If someone does, then please refer to them. But I'm fairly certain that a disproportionate number of the neurodivergent population are self-employed. And there's a couple of reasons for that, not the least of which is the fact that the world is built for neurotypical people, and the recruitment process certainly so. My CV will tell you I was a primary school teacher, but it won't tell you that I got my first job on the 13th interview. I was very good at persuading interview panels. My heart was in it. I'd work extremely hard to develop children's self-esteem and confidence and love of learning. And the general reaction from interview panels was, wow, he sounds like he'd make a really good teacher. I hope he gets a job somewhere. Because there'd always be someone who just sits down and gives the correct answers. Now, that's the recruitment discussion is possibly a discussion for another question. But one advantage about self-employment is that things are on your terms. And there are advantages and disadvantages about that. I give talks about employment and self-employment, advantages, disadvantages. But given that the recruitment process in the workplace is often not as flexible as we often need it to be, there is quite a lot of advantage in self-employment. Or even if it's formal employment, flexible employment, like when it was talking about, any working environment that allows you the flexibility to work on the terms that you know work for you, rather than what the company has decided must work for everyone.
Yeah.
Also,
so it's about that kind of homogenization, that kind of everything being standardized, and you've got to sort of fit into that pattern. Whereas when you're freelance, you can very much make up your own rules. I mean, I agree. I haven't had a real job since I was in my early 20s. I've been either self-employed or running my own business. And then hilariously, Genius Within has now got too big for me, and I had to give up the CEO-ship because it was too much like being employed in the corporate sector. So that kind of that flexibility and insurgency, and kind of, you know, wanting to but not just wanting to, actually needing to. And I think Whitney said something that's very important to me. It's about energy peaks and flows. So, you know, if you've got a job where you're the visible leader of a company, you need to be much more consistent in terms of how you present and how you turn up. And we decided that there were other neurodivergent leaders in Genius Within with different neurotypes who would do a better job of that than me. You know, I'm a good entrepreneur, a good startup, but not a good maintainer. So
I've speaking as a former primary school teacher who's been a part of a system which did not work particularly well for me. Teaching in special education was a lot better because the school understood the value of flexibility. And but yeah, I think there's an extra element to this as well, the fact that not only does flexibility work for neurodivergent thinkers, I think we need to also talk about the underappreciated creativity that comes in so many neurodivergent brains, including brains with learning disabilities, for example. There's this one lad who I do creative writing with, and he's one of those lads who, within the opening sentence of conversation, you know, he has some level of learning difficulties, but the ideas he comes out with are so off the wall creative, the stuff that no one else is going to think about. Like he created this fictional world. He's telling me all about his this fictional world in his head. And one of the things in this world is it's illegal to hold up a potato at someone because that means you're insulting them. It's also illegal to swear if you have coins in your pockets. Do you know why? Because it means you're insulting the king, because the king's face is on top of these coins, so you can't swear. And these are ideas that I think if he were neurotypical, or I'd go one step further, if he didn't have learning disabilities, he probably wouldn't have that off-the-wall creativity that's completely flies in the face of the stereotype that autistic people aren't allowed to be creative. We're supposed to be imaginationless or some rubbish like that.
I think there's a stereotype about there are some stereotypes about there. I'm so far removed from the places where those stereotypes exist. It's hard for me to connect. Thank you for sharing, Chris. So some good points there about why neurodivergent thinkers work better when we can work to our own pace and under our own rules, and how that creativity emerges, and some really lovely ideas there, Chris, about learning disabilities, which we'll circle back on. We've got a question in the chat about Down syndrome, and so we'll come back to that at the end. Steve, coming to you, I think it's interesting because the tech sector isn't always associated with creativity. However, the people I know who work in tech are often incredibly creative because it's a kind of problem solving and an innovation approach, and also wanting to create things that look beautiful in technology. It also draws on a lot of creative skills. But the people that work for Auticon are kind of in a middle place between being self-employed and being full-time employed. So, you know, how does that work for you, and what barriers do your do the autistic Auticon team experience in the workplace?
So I think, and firstly, just to point out, so all of our consultants, obviously we deploy them onto IT-based projects, but they were all employees, full-time employees of Auticon. And so the importance of that is actually, and coming back to one of the points that Chris mentioned about self-employment being on kind of your terms, it's really coming back to the fact that, to answer your question, Nancy, we really start with culture. When we're having a conversation with a client, you know, this is a journey to neuro-inclusion fundamentally.
Yeah.
You know, and there isn't necessarily a definitive endpoint in that, you know, and, you know, for us, it really it does start with culture, because a lot of companies, they talk to us about, okay, this is great, we've got a short-term need for an IT consultant, but actually, can you help us around, long-term recruitment of neurodiverse talent? And the short answer is yes, of course, but actually, let's look at the cultural aspect. Let's look at how your existing employees, if you're a meaningful sized company, how do you communicate with those neurodiverse individuals already? Do you encourage that disclosure? And if you do encourage that disclosure, do you have the tools in place to be able to support those individuals? So I think, that's the starting point. And if we start looking at creativity on top of that, I think you're absolutely right in what you said, Nancy. We are, in a different sector by definition, but actually, when we talk about technology projects, when we talk about data science, what we're actually talking about is a more diverse and creative team that produces innovative outputs and outcomes. And I don't necessarily think that there's much of a differentiation between industries when it comes to that. And I think, we've all heard of the old adage that kind of goes along the lines of, companies employ the same type of person. Well, yes. If you employ the same type of person, then arguably you're going to get the same type of results. So, when we're talking to companies, it's very much about broadening those horizons. And actually, there is a part here for awareness and education, because again, without sort of teaching everyone here to sort of suck eggs, I think, neurodiversity has played runner-up really to end gender and ethnicity in the D&I space. And so there's a lot of misconceptions, a lot of myths surrounding neurodiversity in terms of terminology. What does it mean? And then it's about breaking it down. So what are those minor accommodations, minor adjustments? And so I guess in one sense, we see ourselves not only as a provider of IT consultants, but we are arguably in the fear and risk mitigation business to make sure that everyone is on that same level of understanding and don't see it as a big scary thing to be interacting or indeed working with neurodiverse individuals as part of their team.
Yeah. So Sarah, from your sort of representing the employer's perspective here, do you think, do you find that there are benefits of a more diverse workforce? What do you perceive those to be? How do you kind of make those benefits come out in the work that you're doing?
Absolutely, there's benefit by recruiting from that broad range of skill sets. You're picking out on people's strengths. So not everybody is going to be good at everything, and it's recognizing that. And like Steve just mentioned there, it's about saying who's good at what, where does that fit into what we want to achieve as our overarching strategic objective, and how can we get from A to B, building up the best team. And it's recognizing that you don't, again, probably repeating what Steve said, you don't want to just do the same thing over and over again. What you want to do as an organization is to excel. You want to keep ahead of the game, and you want to outperform your competition. So by picking out the kind of the key skills from your talent pool, and also make sure that you attract the widest talent pool that you can, that's going to give you that competitive advantage and drive your business forward.
So when we're consulting with businesses, one of the first things that comes up is, how many people are we talking about here? So we've either got companies who have done some surveys and they've got a kind of disclosure rate that's quite low. I have had lots of companies say to me, well, we don't really employ any neurodivergent people. And I go, well, you've got more than 100, probably do, but they might not be disclosed. And I'm working with a company in the US right now that's got 35,000 staff on the continental USA, and they reckon they've only got 100 people, just over 100 people with any disability at all, including neurodiversity. So there's a big gap, isn't there, between what people are saying, how people are presenting in the workplace and whether people are disclosed. And I think there's also a gap in diagnosis. So what I say to people about disclosure is, stop waiting for people to come to you to ask for help. Assume they are there and start providing it. And then what you'll find is that your disclosure rates will go up because people will feel safe to talk about it. But the other layer to this is what about diagnosis? Do you accept self-diagnosis? Do you allow people to kind of present themselves as autistic or ADHD or dyslexic without that formal diagnosis? Whitney, could I ask you to speak a bit to that? Because I think with some of the groups you work with, there's a much more of an underdiagnosis issue. Would you agree?
Yeah, and I wanted to kind of build on something that Steve said previously around kind of looking at people's kind of D&I, and we see like race and then gender and neurodiversity, that actually, there's also this issue in seeing these things as kind of in fragments, and race is over here and neurodiversity is over here, because actually if you kind of think about neurodiversity, there's a lot of intersectionality within that. So for example, we know that kind of girls and women might present differently, and we know that a lot of the research is more inclined to kind of look at men and boys. So, and a lot of the stereotypes are very much kind of aimed at kind of men and boys and white men and white boys, for example. So because girls are socialized a lot more, we may be more able to mask, for example. So therefore we might get kind of missed out in school or in different places, or people might assume that we don't have a neurodivergence because we're able to kind of negotiate or look like we can negotiate social circumstances. And then you add race into that. And we already know, again, that, if you're from Black and brown communities, you're less likely to receive a diagnosis, or, even within the community, we again might play into the stereotypes. So a lot of the conversations I've had with my friends, and I say that someone as of mixed heritage, okay, so I'm coming from a community that is predominantly Black and brown, and even within our community, we buy into the stereotypes, and we might see kind of autism, for example, as something that you'd see in the white community, or kind of with white males, because this is what the media and everything presents to us. So we might even struggle to identify this kind of within ourselves. So then even if you've got the intersection of being a kind of a woman from a Black and brown community, you might have that kind of double masking. So we're already trying to navigate through society and navigate through kind of whiteness in a sense, and then we're masking from a neurodiverse perspective as well. So we might just be completely unseen in so many of different sectors, education, places of work, and this tends to mean that there's kind of so much more undiagnosed neurodiversity within these communities. And then when we start to think about class and poverty within that as well, just having access, one of the reasons why I started to speak more about being neurodiverse, because I've known I've been neurodiverse since I was a teenager, but I've started to speak more and more openly about it because I realized there were so many people within my own community that didn't realize they were neurodiverse, and they've been struggling to try and get through. But because none of this is being spoken about, and kind of waiting for an assessment can take months, even years, or the cost of an autism assessment is like £2,000-3,000. No one has that within my community. So there's so many kind of different barriers in order for us to kind of get a diagnosis in the first instance and understand ourselves and see ourselves within the wider kind of neurodivergent or neurodiverse community, that so many times we are completely missed out of the conversation and aren't presented, and our voices aren't heard. So I think this process of kind of barriers and undiagnosis is bigger than what we're seeing at the moment. I think if we look at numbers now and probably double or triple of them, we'll start to get closer to what we're really thinking about.
Yeah, I would concur with that. There was a study published in 2021, a review of the children within the special educational needs system in the UK, and there, and a breakdown of the race and ethnicity demographic and the gender demographic. And there's real evidence of intersectional, layered, compound adverse impact. So, although for the first time there was parity between the percentage of Black boys being diagnosed and white boys being diagnosed, that parity wasn't there in Asian and Roma communities. And even though the diagnosis had achieved parity between Black and white boys for the first time, the provision of educational healthcare plans and support was not equal. And so again, white boys were receiving more educational support than Black boys. And then when you added being female into that, there were on average 15 white boys receiving help in school for being autistic for every one Black girl. And so exactly as you say, Whitney, it's that layering of the adverse impact that I think is really, and so from an employer's perspective, when we bring those kind of stories, when we graduate and we grow up, and someone's popped in the chat about education status, struggling at college, not with the material but by the system, it puts you in a terrible disadvantage. That sense of being an outsider, that's the psychology that people are bringing into the workplace, and therefore the additional support needs kind of quite vary. I haven't got a sort of specific person to come to, but would anybody else like to follow up on that in terms of the experience of employers then providing some sort of support for that layered process?
I'll come in there, Nancy.
Thank you, Sarah.
We've actually had a couple of examples in the workplace on supporting employees through psychological assessments, picking out on that profiling, if you like. And those examples have been both employee-led and manager-led. So I think once people are in the workplace, it's easier to manage, but it's generating that culture where people feel comfortable, knowing that they're with a supportive employer and that they will be, they're encouraged to speak up, and then know that they will be supported and not disadvantaged for putting their hand up and saying, I'm struggling with this, or I find it difficult to do this in my day job. So, like I said, employee-led and manager-led. And I think we need, as an employer, we need to coach and support our managers so that they feel comfortable to have quite brave and open conversations with their employee. And that's a challenge, because that's a difficult thing to do, sit face to face with somebody and say, I've picked up on, there is an issue here. Do you know that you have an issue? So it's trying to kind of facilitate that conversation. And then the employee-led element, there might be friction between two employees. There might be friction between employee and manager. And you rely on that employee coming forward and asking for support. But in both those circumstances, we have been supportive, and we have now managed to kind of overcome the challenges and the barriers that were there in those specific circumstances. I think to pick on the disclosure piece in terms of recruitment, that is a challenge, because as an employer, there are not limited number of, you have to get your message across, you have to get people to apply. And it's about that continual evaluation and seeing how can we attract people to apply for jobs within our vacancies, within our organisation, and then how can we accommodate individual needs. I have read that the new generation coming into work, they are more open probably to disclosing that they do have certain character traits or reasonable adjustments that they might request. But I suppose the evidence is actually in analysing the job applications coming in.
That's it, yeah. And Gail, is it Gail or Neil? Someone with the surname Hilliard has popped in the chat about is getting into the workplace in the first place, which I think is a very good point. And so at Genius Within, we work in prisons and we work with people who are long-term unemployed. And I've worked in the welfare to work sector since about 2002 and spent many years campaigning for the Department of Work and Pensions to treat neurodivergent conditions within the disability support programs, rather than kind of having neurodivergent people within the pool of everyday unemployment, because the needs are different and the statistics do kind of make that quite clear. So around 30% of unemployed people are dyslexic, around 25% of the prison population have ADHD, and that's compared to 10% of dyslexics in the general population and 5% in the prison population. So we've got this huge overrepresentation, and I think most of us have seen statistics about how low the disability employment gap is for autistic people and for people with learning disabilities. So coming back again to that category of people who are learning disabled, who might also have autism, the autistic, who might also be diagnosed with conditions like Down syndrome. I wonder if Chris or Steve could speak to that. I feel like there's a risk with the neurodiversity movement that we're kind of doing a bit of kind of shiny, we've got magical, mystical work fairies who will be brilliant at creative thinking and help you with your work. And we're not kind of necessarily selling the fact that there's a double-edged sword to this, that there are both, strengths and this, but the struggles are really are real. Are we glossing over the idea that all neurodiversity is about people being brilliant, and actually there's a much more nuanced look that we need to be more inclusive as a field in terms of incorporating all forms of neurodivergence?
Yeah, my personal opinion about the Autism Awareness movement is that meaningful autism awareness / acceptance means talking about the strengths and talking about the weaknesses, but veering away from historically what society's done too much of, which is talk about weaknesses in a way that a disabled and or autistic person would read it and think, oh, well, I guess I'm not supposed to be that good at stuff. So, yeah, meaningful autism awareness to me is to talk about the strengths and celebrating the strengths whilst mentioning the weaknesses, because if we don't talk about the challenges that come with being autistic, then who on earth is going to provide the provisions that we need, of course. But it's about focusing on the strengths, but also talk about the weaknesses in a way that does not make the autistic person feel like they're lesser. And I do also want to, I think it depends on the advocate and it depends on the discussion, to be honest, whether we're going too far in saying that, oh, everything about autism is absolutely amazing. But if we are, I think it's largely because of consciously or subconsciously, an effort to fight back against decades and decades of autism being talked about as if we don't deserve to be here, and certainly do not deserve to have jobs. So it's kind of using an unbalanced argument to rebalance a historical argument, maybe. I'm sure there's been a history.
And what's interesting to me is the history of that narrative. I look back and you look through the research and you can find autism, ADHD, dyslexia being talked about from the kind of industrialization era onwards. There's very little before that. And so there's a kind of idea that neurodivergence really only exists in relation to a modern system that creates such narrow pathways of success. I mean, if you can't read, if you can't spell, if you can't do maths, if you're not able to sit still for long periods, if you're not able to concentrate in very busy environments, then you will leave school feeling devalued and like you're not going to be successful. And that then is what we bring into the workplace, which I think also, and that affects people with visible disability as well, Linda, your comment about the expectations. So I think it's, there's that kind of need to just be realistic about this and say, how are we actually measuring success? Do we think of success as only people that can do those 4 things? Or does success mean something else to us as a community, as a species, as a globe? And we keep hearing about the future of work, don't we? And this amazing future in which people are going to need to be innovative and creative. And yet we're still spending 12 years teaching people spelling and grammar, where we've actually pretty much all got smartphones now that do that for us. And we don't actually really need spelling and grammar anymore. So we've got this sort of big mismatch between an education system that sets people up for certain types of success, and those types of success are no longer welcome in the workplace. We actually need people who will break rules, not follow them. Steve, we haven't heard from you for a while, but I'm sure in your work at Autism you've got something that would speak to that.
Well, exactly. I mean, what Chris was just saying about weaknesses and not sort of undervaluing people based on what appears to be weaknesses. It's just such a great point. I mean, coming back to, again, something else Chris said earlier about, the kind of CVs and not actually seeing what's behind it. I think, our kind of mantra is, do not put neurodiverse people into situations that really aren't going to allow them to present their, put the best foot forward. I mean, a classic example of that is interviews. There is absolutely no correlation between how someone performs in an interview and arguably a fake shop window environment, and whether they're a good coder or tester or whatever the job is. And so, for us, and then again, coming back to something Sarah said about managers, I think, as an employer here, we look at profiles really as a starting point. But what we're interested in is what those individuals could and should be doing. So, yes, we look at academic backgrounds, technology-based ability, but actually we effectively test the cognitive skills of all of our consultants. And the reason for that really is to understand, what those cognitive skills are, so that we, as the kind of operations team, if you like, talking to our clients, can understand whether that person's best suited to a really fast-paced environment that uses agile methodology in a tech startup type of environment, whether it's part of a much bigger team, there's maybe more repetitive tasks involved, so that we stand the best chance of actually making sure there's a match, not only between that individual and that role, but also within the unwritten rules of that team, that company, and the project that they're going to be working on as well, which I think, typically interviews do not draw that out in the slightest. In fact, they're an absolute hindrance and a source of huge anxiety, as many of us know, to those with neurodiverse conditions.
It's been such a, I studied occupational and organizational psychology in the early 2000s, and 20 years ago, I was reviewing systematic reviews of the lack of predictive validity within interviews. That unstructured interviews do not predict job performance. Why are we still using them so ubiquitously when they actually don't predict whether someone will be good at the job? I agree with you, Stephen, as an employer of a 60% disabled staff team and a 75% neurodivergent leadership team, we've long looked at matching, and this is going to come to you, Sarah, so prepare yourself. But if I'm hiring for finance, for example, I give someone a spreadsheet full of holes because that's the direct match for the job that I'm hiring for. And then I don't care how they feed those holes and interpretations back to me, whether they do it in an email, an interview, a telephone call, whatever their preferred communication style is. Because what I actually want them to be able to do is work their way around a spreadsheet, find the things that aren't working properly and make interpretations. So, what do you think we have to do, Sarah, to move the world? It's one thing to make exceptions for people that ask for help, and it's another thing to have a systematic approach to inclusion and to diversity across your processes, where people don't need to ask for accommodations because you're just doing things in a way that makes sense. Sarah, how do we get from where we are now to that place?
I wholeheartedly agree with everything that you and Steve have just said about, recruitment and making those processes suit the needs of the role rather than following a standardized process for the sake of it. in a previous life, I worked in an oil and gas company, and they went through a hiring exercise for apprentices. It was a 4-year apprenticeship. And it's almost, I think the way, to answer your question, Nancy, I think the way that you generate change is by challenging and saying, okay, so we've always done it like that, but why? And that doesn't necessarily make it the right thing to do. And also, what are you looking to achieve? So in this role, it was about saying to the manager, well, this is a new area for me. What are we looking for the person to do? Well, we want them to weld. Okay, what do you need to what makes a good welder? What are the key skills? Hand-eye coordination. So that's what you should be testing. You can't ask, school leavers in particular. That's a daunting experience. You're, coming along for an interview, trying to present yourself. You may not necessarily have been a high achiever at school. So these things are really daunting. So we completely refreshed the process and had an open day where candidates could come down. It was on a Saturday, so that made it more accessible. And candidates came down, they tried their hand at some various tasks without maybe giving them a welding torch, but to do tasks that replicated what they would need to do during the day. And that's how they chose their selection. And that was followed by an interview, but just a brief chat, really, just to get to know the person. So, like I said, to answer your question, because I know we're short of time, I think it's about challenging and really saying, like Steve said as well, and his workforce is obviously made up of, what is the job role? Let's test that.
Lovely, lovely. And we're going to close with, one thing that this panel could change. If you could wave a magic wand and change one thing, what would it be? And I'm going to go first because that's the chair's privilege. So the one thing I would change is, we've heard about culture change from 3 of our panelists now, and I think there's a need for double loop learning. So every time you have to make an accommodation for one, ask yourself, is this something that would benefit everybody? And can we make this the way we do things around here? And if you've had to make the same accommodation for 10% of your staff, there's a business case for putting it in as standard. And so it's always, my one thing would be always asking yourself, is this, if I react to this one person, actually, is there a huge well of unmet need that hasn't asked for help yet, that could benefit from exactly the same thing? And that question, I think, will just start iteratively moving us towards a more neuro-inclusive approach. So who else has got one thing that they can share? Whitney, have you got one thing?
So I was thinking about, we think so much about the practicalities, and so much of the time we forget that all of us neurodiverse people, we're human beings as well, and we have all of these emotions. So creating more kind of reflective practice, especially in corporates, around kind of training and employment, around, there's so much rejection that we face. There's so much the feelings of being an outsider, imposter syndrome, and actually, a lot of the culture can be quite kind of shaming because we don't work in the way that society sees fit, which tends to be a neurotypical way of working. So bringing the emotions into the workplace and understanding kind of that shame, and there's big overwhelming emotions around a lot of this as well, and creating the space to actually think about that side of things as well, not just the practicalities. The practicalities are needed, but we're also human beings that have emotions.
Absolutely. Beautifully said. Beautifully said.
As for me, other than the create a culture in the workplace where people actually feel free and open to talk about being neurodivergent, I'd say that my one thing would be, if all employers could be open to their employees in general, but specifically for the most neurodivergent employees, using whichever methods work for them rather than the one that is just the way we've always done it. I've heard it said a couple of times that the most damaging thing a company can say, I don't think it's literally true, but apparently one of the most damaging things a company can say for its future is, but that's the way we've always done it.
Yeah.
I'm talking about how companies in general need to be flexible about their business dealings, but they also need to allow their employees that same flexibility. And so just because the neurotypical boss doesn't think a method works does not mean it suddenly magically no longer makes sense in the employee's brain. So allow them to approach tasks on their terms.
Thank you.
So
thank you, Chris.
Yeah, do it.
And Steve, very briefly from you.
I just loved what Whitney said there, and you know, for me, it really comes down to that same kind of human to human kind of level. Really, it's, you know, it's empathy and kindness at a management level. You know, working with people in your teams, just because you can't see something, it doesn't mean it's not there, and that extra little bit of empathy and kindness will start that shift. 100%. And it's difficult in some cultures. They're fast paced, they're, you know, but that's where it's got to start for me, I think.
Yeah, brilliant. And a last word from you, Sarah, as well.
I think for me it would be acceptance. You know, accepting people as the individuals that they are, and working with them.
Wonderful. And very concise, which I would like to thank you.
I know you're short of time.
Absolutely. So I think this is the end of our session. This is where we close at 20 past. Correct me if I'm wrong, host. And I'd just like to thank our panelists, particularly those that have stepped in last minute to replace those who are recovering from COVID right now. So thank you, Whitney and Sarah. I know you were very last minute replacements. Steve, I'm not sure if I think you've replaced one of your colleagues. Yeah, absolutely. So Chris, it was just you and me. It was just you and me originally, and look at the value we've had added to us. Yes. So thanks ever so much, and thanks for the questions in the chat, everybody. Sorry if I missed one. Multitasking only goes so far, even when you have an ADHD brain. So yeah, thanks ever so much. Enjoy the rest of your afternoon.
Bye for now.
Thanks,
Bye.
Thank you.